Frank, thank you so much for being willing to be our first person today and spend this time with you. We'll try not to hold you from getting to work too long, but we're going to keep you for our complete hour. You have a lot to share with us, so we'll jump right into it if that's okay with you.
Good.
Hitler came to power in 1933. You've said that your earliest memories start in 1934 when you were 5 years old. You also said of that time, quote, all in all, it was a good time for your parents. Tell us why that was so and what you can about your family and their life in Gleiwitz and about yourself in those first years of life.
My father graduated from medical school and did his residency in Breslau, which is about 100 miles away. And his teacher at the medical school basically was overloaded, and he sent him quite a few patients in our area because it's 100 miles away, so that he got settled very quickly. And in fact, I usually say 3 important things happened in 1933. One is my father got a car.
And that was a big deal.
Yes. He didn't need a car for the practice. It stayed in a garage about 2 blocks away, and we used it primarily to visit my grandparents. So I really got a chance to know them quite well, and very much appreciated that. The other thing which happened is that my mother's parents celebrated the 100th anniversary of their wholesale leather business and tannery, which was in Oppeln, probably about 40 miles to the west of Gleiwitz. And my father's family was about 20 miles east of Gleiwitz. And we visited them frequently. And the other thing, of course, was the fact that Hitler came to power. Those 3 events really influenced our lives considerably.
Frank, you started school in 1935, attending a public school. You told me that recess was the most dangerous time for you. Will you say a little bit about that?
Because then we were pretty much in a group, and we generally looked for safety between the boys section and the girls section, because the propaganda was beginning to be very effective, that we were dangerous and we were free game. We also got dismissed about 5 minutes early and could start 5 minutes late, so that we came without being harassed.
So basically give you a head start so that you wouldn't be bullied and harassed, give you a 5-minute head start to get home.
Correct.
Yeah. In 1936, circumstances for your parents turned more ominous and became more difficult, if not more dangerous. What changed in 1936, and what did it mean for your family?
There was a war between 1920 and 21, which eventually led to the Polish state, which didn't exist. Poland was part of the Habsburg Empire. In order to protect both sides, there was kind of an amnesty on the Nazi laws until 1936. And we knew when that would be over. And My parents, for instance, told me I have to learn how to swim because we may very well take an ocean voyage. And I remember my grandfather stayed with me at the pool until I passed the swimming test.
In case you had to take a trip across the ocean.
Exactly.
In 1936, Frank, your mother took a trip to Israel. Tell us why she went. What was that trip about and what happened?
We were looking for places to go. And at that time, Israel had about one doctor for every 100 population. So basically, she concluded that he couldn't make a living and that we had to look someplace else.
You mentioned this amnesty that had been created after 1920, thereabouts, and that it was due to expire in 1936. I believe you and your family had gone on a trip in July 1936. When you returned from this vacation, that treaty had expired. What did that mean to you?
We had an SA, in other words, the brown shirts guard in front of the apartment building where my father had his office. We had the Stürmer, which was Goebbels' main, almost comic newspaper, which showed, which was only anti-Semitic images and basically was part of the major propaganda.
And they were plastered everywhere.
Everywhere, every street corner.
Every street corner, yeah. One of the things you shared with me is, at that time, as you mentioned, you had this family business for 100 years, the dramatic downhill slide of the business after 1936. Share a little bit of that with us.
In 1933, at the time of their anniversary, they had a turnover of about 100,000 marks. By 1938, it was down to 20.
An 80% drop in that
yes.
period, yeah, because of boycotts and...
Yes.
So what happened to your father's practice? You know, the brown shirt showed up trying to block people from going.
He also wasn't able to collect insurance. And Germany's always had socialized medicine, okay, where the government took care of the bills, and this was prohibited. He was prohibited from using that.
So Jewish doctors could not collect.
Correct.
Under the healthcare system.
So he realized 3 weeks later than the people who lived in Western Germany that he couldn't make a living. That it wouldn't blow over.
And it wouldn't blow over. Once he knew he couldn't make a living being a successful physician that he had been, what did he do then?
Basically, he looked what he can do. He took a trip to the United States, where my grandfather was a genealogist, and he found that the Orgler family was, had two relatives in the United States who left early. Mainly, one of the Orgler women in the early 1700s married a Michael Gratz, and settled in Philadelphia, where they were one of the leading families. They became financiers of the revolution, and they also started Gratz College in Philadelphia, which still exists. And he found out in the city hall that Rebecca Gratz, the daughter, or I think the granddaughter, excuse me, never married, so had no relatives, and her brother moved out west. That was Louisville, Kentucky. And
the far West.
And he married there, but never left any trail. Mm-hmm. So his only choice was to visit somebody who had the son-in-law of my great-grandfather, came to my great-grandfather and said, I'm in some financial trouble. I need 3,000 thaler, which was a load of money at that time.
This was in the early 1900s, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
And he lent him the money and never heard from him again because he used it to go to the United States and settled in New York. And in 1938, his son was a vice president of Bendix Aviation with, by the way, an income of 1938, which was the height of the Depression, of $38,000.
Which was a whopping
We got an affidavit from him which guaranteed that we wouldn't be on welfare for a year.
Once you came to the United States.
Right.
Yep.
Since we had taken advantage of something that if you took a German boat and went first class, you had a pretty good spending allowance. And basically we lived on that for about a year. And never took anything, but when Crystal Night came, which was...
Frank, before we get to that, if I can talk about a couple of other things.
Go ahead.
Before we get to that point. While you were, soon after your father lost his practice and about the time he was going to make the trip to New York to see what he could work out, one of the things that you, I think, if I remember right, that in order to make ends meet, you had a family garden, which was really important, I think, a plot of land where you had a tree, and that was the only safe place to play. I remember you sharing.
Correct. It was called the Schrebergarten, which was just outside of town. It was walkable. In fact, I showed my kids where it was, and also the trail where I learned how to ride a bicycle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you took your trip with your family.
Yes.
And you also, you shared with me that your family did not keep a kosher kitchen. That wasn't what your family did. But when you were at that point in Gleiwitz, you only bought kosher meat. Will you share why that was?
There were about 1,000 families in Gleiwitz. The only way to keep the butcher in business was that everybody bought kosher meat. And that was a way that the community helped each other.
Right. Now, of course, as you shared, your father went to New York. He was able to meet the son of the man who had borrowed the money to go to New York and get his commitment to get you an affidavit. Tell us what happened in your father's attempts to get the proper paperwork from the embassy that would allow him to then leave.
Well, in those days, when times are rough, corruption runs rampant. We got a number as soon as he came back, which was for the visa quota, in fact, which is mentioned in our exhibit, America and the Holocaust, which showed that the quota was never filled until 1939.
Until 1939.
So we got the number and nothing happened. After 3 months in April, my father called a friend and said, look, why don't you send a big box of candy to Fräulein Schmidt, who's the consul's German secretary? She's been known to help. So we waited about another month.
After he had sent the chocolates.
Yes.
Yep, he sent the chocolates.
And nothing happened. So he called his friend again. He said, "Didn't you put a 100-mark bill into the box of candy?" And with a second box of candy and a $100 bill, 2 weeks later we got the request for a physical, and my father took and got a visa which was good for 120 days.
And that was significant, that 120-day limit, right?
Yes, because my father had to study for the state boards. He decided to try Ohio, which was passing 50% of all the people taking it. So we didn't want to use any other expenses, so that we took passage in October to be at the end
of that
120 days.
Soon after your father got the visa, when he got it before he left, he had a visit from the Gestapo. Will you talk a little bit about that?
When we got oh, by the way, all bank accounts for Jewish families were frozen, and you had to depend on what the state tells you you're allowed to spend. And it was forbidden to take any other withdrawals. Germany had the equivalent of a lease where the leasee basically gave a mortgage to the landlord to show that he intends to stay there. And the minute he got the visa, he called the landlord and canceled the lease. The day after, he got a visit from 2 SS people and said, "Doctor, you're under arrest." He said, "For what?" "You did a major withdrawal from the bank. What did you do with that?" So he said, "I transferred it to my bank." And he called the bank. Fortunately, the president of the bank confirmed that he had deposited that money, and they were satisfied and left. Shortly after that, he left, I think in the beginning of July.
And so now your father, he has left, leaving you and your
Yes.
mom behind. You and your mother, as you said, were able to leave in October, right before that 120-day period ended, in October 38, almost 4 months after your father left. What was it like for you and your mother to remain in Gleiwitz with your father gone, and then describe the circumstances that led up to your departure in October 1938?
Well, we had a couple of things happen. One is playing tag in the Schrebergarten. I broke my arm. Now, there's no way of calling 911. So I took my bicycle and rode home and told my mother about it. And she immediately called the orthopedist, who said, "Sorry, I don't treat Jewish children." So she frantically started calling people in nearby places, and she did get a positive response in my dad's hometown of Boynton, who said, "Look, get a taxi, go to the rear entrance of the Catholic orphanage, and I'll be there and I'll set the arm. So he gave instructions to my mother to have the pediatrician do the prescribed procedures of stretching. And she did such a good job that my left arm really goes further than my right arm, but it's never bothered me.
And Frank, the orthopedic surgeon and other doctors your mother tried to get, many of them had been former colleagues of your father.
Right, and they had dinners together, at the hospital.
And they would not treat you. Yeah. What else happened during that summer of 1938 while you're waiting, and into the fall of 38 while you're waiting to go? How did your mother make ends meet, to be able to feed you at that point?
Well, we were able to withdraw what was prescribed from the bank accounts.
The little bit that you were allowed to take, you
Correct.
Had that.
And we lived in a furnished room because we'd given up the lease. Mm-hmm. And we survived.
Mm-hmm. And during that time, of course, your mother's trying to make the arrangements to try to get, your belongings, try to get them to go with you. Tell us about that process.
We basically rented a container, which was called the Lift. Mm-hmm. And at that time, we could still take out any belongings, providing we paid 100% tax. And we were able to use the bank account for that.
You could use the bank account to pay that tax.
So my mother, besides furniture, which was easily transportable, also my bicycle and anything, and my father's office equipment, because again, we needed to reduce our expenses. And there was a customs official who checked every item going forward. And once that was done, you
were permitted to go.
We were permitted to go.
Tell us how much money, cash, were you allowed to take with you?
10 marks.
10 marks.
Which is probably, with inflation, about $50 today.
Today. That's what you were allowed to leave with.
Yes. Mm. Now, in the meantime, you've probably heard of Munich, where Hitler had a conference with the prime ministers of France and Britain, Chamberlain and Daladier, during which the two prime ministers gave Hitler permission to invade Czechoslovakia without their consent. This was one of the travesties of pre-World War II, because the Czechs had 14 divisions on Germany's southern border. So it basically changed the balance of power.
And why was that significant for you at that point in time? Because it affected your ability to leave.
In order to show his threat, he called back all ships at sea, which caused a delay of 4 days. The Europa, which is a ship that we were booked on, had to go back to Bremen, and it took 6 days to cross the Atlantic, and usually 1 day to turn it around. It's not like today where they turn it around between 9 and 3. And when we got to the port, there was no ship. We went 4 weeks, 3.5 weeks later, and we were getting constant cables from my father, get an earlier ship, which wasn't possible because everybody was panicking.
And of course...
And we didn't know what it was because we got all news was totally censored. There was no internet. It was a capital offense for us to listen to foreign radio stations. For instance, Strasbourg had a propaganda station and that's on the border of Germany and France. And we had no idea what was happening. We did hear that we should get back. We have to stay another day in Bremen and can take the boat train to Bremerhaven, which is where the ship was leaving the next day. It was only the next day, which, by the way, I was very pleased to hear was a holiday in the United States. It was Columbus Day. And then we got an idea of what was going on. The rest of the trip was uneventful, except this was during the hurricane season. And my mother, we had getting the cheapest first class ticket got us in the nose of the ship. And my mother never left her room. And I was spending my time in the promenade deck watching the nose of the ship dive into the waves and then kind of stay under. And then when the water got off, we popped up, which was fascinating to me.
For a 9-year-old boy standing there.
Now, at one time, I was one of 6 people in the first class dining room.
Everybody else is ill or staying below.
Yeah, but the 5 people were at the captain's table.
And you.
And I had a table.
All to yourself?
I had a table all to myself, which I thought was very good service.
Frank, so October 1938, you made it to the United States. You joined your father in Cleveland, Ohio, before the 3 of you would end up moving to Dayton, Ohio. Tell us about your adjustment when you came to the United States.
I had a very easy time. In other words, I had a very friendly teacher, Miss Emanuel, who they put me back one semester. And I had had some English lessons before. And for Hanukkah, I got a sled. And it happens, it wasn't a flexible flyer, but a sled that I think was $2. But we were right at a park which had a hill.
It had a hill.
So I really enjoyed the snowfall in January. And Cleveland gets quite a bit of snow.
Yes,
it's on
it
the
does.
lake.
Yes, it does. And that was January of '39. In the fall, soon after you got there, in the fall of 1938...
it was in February '39.
Right, but I'm going to take you back a little bit while you're in Cleveland before that point, right before the night of Kristallnacht.
Oh.
If you'll share that with us.
That was probably the longest hour of my life. At 9 o'clock at night, I got a person-to-person.
And this is November 9th, 1938,
yeah,
right?
I got a person-to-person call from my grandparents. I don't know if you know what a person-to-person call was. The telephone company featured a more expensive version where the operator waits for the proper person to answer the phone. And this was, I believe, on a Wednesday when the local movie featured, I think, a 25-cent ticket on a Wednesday. And my parents decided that was the first time they went out. And they asked a neighbor to look in on me. I wouldn't have a babysitter, but she checked a couple of times. And when I got that call, I knew something was wrong because from the trip across every day, we were an hour earlier. So I knew that there was a 6-hour time difference. So the call was at 3 in the morning.
From Germany. Yep.
My grandparents would not have called at 3 o'clock in the morning if something wasn't wrong.
Right.
So finally my parents came back at 10.
Mm-hmm.
And they heard that my mother's brothers were arrested, that the business had been confiscated, and they were desperate to try to get at least my mother's brothers out, because older people generally didn't want to leave to take the affidavits for younger ones. Mm. So my father took a Greyhound bus to New York and saw the same Charlie Marcus,
who had given him the affidavit,
to get an affidavit, and he said, I know you didn't use any, but this looks like too much responsibility, because that was too close.
So he said no to.
So he said no, and he came home empty-handed. Mm-hmm. My mother's brothers did manage to get passage to Shanghai. Shanghai and the Dominican Republic were the two countries which welcomed visitors for their expertise. And unfortunately, they went on an Italian ship in June, just before during the fall of Paris, which caused Mussolini to declare war on Italy and France, rather on France and Great Britain. And the ship could never get through the Suez Canal. So they went back, and we really didn't get any accurate information, except we did hear through the museum that they eventually died in Auschwitz.
Frank, so many things you could share with us. I want you to tell us, you had mentioned that your mother had made sure to have some of your possessions brought to the United States, got a lift, which followed you. The lift arrives in the United States with your belongings, including your bicycle. Tell us about that.
Friends, and I say that in quotation marks, had a bicycle store. And they volunteered to pack my bicycle in a bicycle box, which turned the wheel sideways and got it in the smallest possible space. And when we unpacked, they had since gotten out to Palestine. And we got a letter from them saying that we should be very careful unpacking the bicycle, because inside the frame they packed a good number of gold coins, which were prohibited again with severe punishment. And my father
they had
was
found them when
furious.
Because they inspected everything when you left.
Correct.
But they missed that. Yeah.
They missed that because they had a black cloth over it.
Yeah.
But my father was furious that they would think of endangering our lives for personal gain. Of course, again, you couldn't take any money out. And people got desperate in various ways.
Mm-hmm. But willing to endanger your
Yes.
well-being and even your life.
Exactly.
Frank, after your father completed the requirements in order for him to be able to practice medicine in the United States in Cleveland, you then moved to Dayton, Ohio, and your father went there with the intent of starting a medical practice. Mm-hmm. Tell us what happened with that, because that is so profound.
One of my favorite sayings, if you get a lemon, make lemonade. He sent in his application for the Medical Society in Dayton as soon as he opened his office, and didn't hear anything, and then all of a sudden there was an emergency meeting on a Friday night, which of course is a Jewish Shabbat. And they passed, and you have to realize, being part of a medical society is a license for legitimacy. And apparently somebody called the Dayton Herald.
But before you tell us that, what did the medical society do?
Requiring citizenship.
So they passed a resolution.
And citizenship takes 5 years after we filed first papers, which we did immediately.
Right. So here they passed that because your father seeks application to get in, and they deny him because now they've required this.
Correct.
Okay.
The next morning, a reporter for the Dayton Herald called my father's office, this was a Saturday, and said, I'd like to see you. Said, I have an open office, I'm here today. And when he came in, he said, would you please give me your credentials, where you studied, and your license, and any other paraphernalia. I'd like to see it. The next morning, the Dayton Herald ran an editorial page, Freedom of Opportunity in the United States. The next Monday, my father had 11 new patients. And this really caused our resettlement to be fast. Mm-hmm. During World War II and immediately after, he obviously couldn't give any affidavits. But by the end of the war, he basically gave 107 affidavits to displaced persons in order to do what he couldn't do for his own family.
And so our audience understands what that meant is each time he was able to make that affidavit, he was basically saying, I will take responsibility for this person.
Correct.
If they can't make a go of it here.
Correct.
107 people.
In fact, he got a major award together with President Truman for the 75th anniversary of the International Highest organization, which is a resettlement group. For his work as an advocate.
Frank, as you said, he was able to really rescue 107 people, but he couldn't save his own family. When did your parents, after the war, when did your family learn about other members of the family?
Just that we stopped hearing from them. We used to get Red Cross letter heavily censored till about 1943 from Theresienstadt, Terezin, which was a so-called benign concentration camp, which put on a show for the Red Cross and then went back to their old ways as soon as they left. But then they basically got a confirmation from Leo Beck. Leo Beck was the chief rabbi in Berlin who had his first pulpit in Oppeln, which was my grandparents' home, and he married my grandparents. So my mother knew him from old days, and he visited the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. My parents went there, and he confirmed that they were deported end of 43.
To Auschwitz.
And of course, we got the final papers through the museum who digitalized all the German papers. The Germans covered all bases and recorded everything. That's called Deutsche Gründlichkeit. It means thoroughness.
Thoroughness, yeah. Did any other family members survive?
A distant cousin. The relationship is Linda Gordon had shared a grandfather with me. But so she was a distant step cousin. They used whatever bribes they had and got to Panama.
To Panama, okay.
And they eventually went to the United States. We've kind of adopted them as family here, which is very nice.
Frank, in the little time we have left, and I know we're going to turn to our audience for a few questions, you returned to Gleiwitz, and you mentioned earlier you showed your children. What was that like for you to take your family back to the place that you lived as a child?
I resisted doing this, even though my 3 children said they're really interested in seeing where we came from. But something happened in, I believe it was 2003. The city of Gleiwitz, which is now Poland, was trying to reconfirm its history because all the Germans had left and all the Poles who lived in the Ukraine, which the Russians took over, basically were used to resettle Upper Silesia and Eastern Germany. So they were trying to kind of redo their history.
Redo their history, yep.
And at that point, I said, let's go. We all met in Berlin and drove to Gleiwitz. And there were 7 of us. One of my daughters worked for AmeriCorps. One of my granddaughters, rather. And the other 2 also couldn't make it. But my grandson did, together with Joni and her husband. And Gleiwitz happens to be about 35 miles from Auschwitz. They decided to go. I decided I don't need to see it. But this was an interesting experience.
I can only imagine.
Yes. And I've since taken Joni's other daughter, rather, Joni's daughter, when I went hiking with them in the giant mountains and the Tatra Mountains between Poland and Slovakia. But it was only a detour of about 50 miles. So we stopped to take a look. And you know, every time I went there, I kind of went like this. How could I have been part of this? It's hard to believe.
Frank, your mother, before I ask about your mom, tell us how you met your wife, Marianne.
I was, by that time, the family driver. And my parents went cross-country twice on different routes. We really wanted to know the country. So we also went to New England. And my parents wanted to stop to rest after a strenuous trip and settled in a small hotel in Lake Placid, New York, which is a very active community in winter. In fact, the Olympics were held there. Right. But in summer, it's absolutely dead with old people. And we were the only people under 40 in the hotel. So it was kind of, it just had to be. Then she went, not only that, but she went horseback riding with her father, who promptly fell off a horse. And since we exchanged addresses, she wrote me a letter, and I answered it. And about 6 months later, my parents had their 25th anniversary and decided to go to New York to celebrate. And I had nothing to do. So I called Marianne, who had gone with her parents. She had taken a course at Penn State, and they also wanted to rest for a week. So after we corresponded a few times, I said, wouldn't it be nice? I have nothing to do over Washington's birthday, which is a long weekend. I'd like to see what Syracuse looks like. I was in Cleveland at Western Reserve. And that started something.
That started something. And there's a pretty amazing coincidence, though, right, about when she came to the United States.
We were on the same boat. She was on the ship which was called back. 4 weeks before.
As they made their escape from Germany
Yes.
as well.
Well, from Austria.
From Austria, from Austria.
And they had business connections, and they were fortunate that her grandfather was a physician for an international insurance company. And when he died in 1937, they were able to get life insurance policy into transferred out of Germany. And they got an affidavit without any liability from a client, the Simons in Philadelphia.
Amazing. I think we'll stop between us for the moment and turn
Okay.
to our audience. Should we do that? We have time for, I think, a couple of questions. We have microphones in the aisle. We ask that you use the microphone. Try to ask make the question as brief as you can, and I'll repeat it just to make sure we heard it correctly. There we go. Thank you. Okay, yes, sir.
Mr. Liebermann, thank you so much for helping us not forget. Listening to you speak and standing in this awe-inspiring place, it's difficult to imagine that we see children's plaques that say, "We'll never forget." I'm just wondering, I'm hearing some things today, even among our political leaders here in Washington, congressmen saying things of anti-Semitic nature. And I'm a bit shocked by it. And has it always been there and I just didn't recognize it? Are we more bold about it, or are we at risk for forgetting? I can't reconcile.
I basically cannot make a political comment. But the medical society tells you something.
That anti-Semitism was there very
Yes.
much back then. And it remains a tremendous concern, Frank, everywhere, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for the
I'm
question.
sorry I can't answer it in more detail.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am. I think this will be our last question, I think. Oh, no, we have one over here.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Basically, I just had a question. You spoke about your bike that you brought over. I was wondering if you had that for quite a long time, or if you still have it, or what happened to your bike.
Do you still have?
It had 28-inch wheels, and I couldn't get spare tires for it. So reluctantly, I traded it in for a Schwinn with 26-inch balloon tires, which was much harder to ride and heavier.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Liebermann, thank you so much for being here. I'm with my students today, and thank you for being such an example of the strength of the human spirit. You just have so much joy and hope. Could you just share with us how you maintained that throughout your challenges in your life?
How have you maintained your hope and joy?
I've always been an optimist, and our survival helped a lot. Mm-hmm. And I never considered myself a refugee because of what happened. Oh, one other thing I forgot to say. Monday morning, Good Samaritan Hospital in Dayton the chief of staff called my father and asked him to come out, and he was on the junior staff until he was a citizen, and on the senior staff for the rest of his practicing days until 1972.
You know, Frank, we're going to close our program now. I'm going to turn back to Frank for one more time. So we ask that you stay with us. I might also mention, your father was remarkable. We don't have time to go into it, but your mom, she wrote a book about what you all went through and published a book.
Basically, she wrote a book, My Life in Two Worlds, on the urging of my 3 children.
Oh, okay.
And she really had trouble doing it because nobody wanted to remember. Mm-hmm. But we do have it. It's at the museum. And I feel good about it.
I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Remind you that we'll have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until August 8th. All of our programs will be on the YouTube channel after we've done them. And all of our programs until the end of May will be live streamed. So one way or the other, we hope you'll see additional programs this year. So thank you for being with us. It's our
I get another chance.
He gets another chance. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. And so with that, I turn back to Frank to close our program.
When I went to Berlin and Gleiwitz, I decided it was high time that I make peace with Germany. Because hate is counterproductive, and it's 3 generations, and you can't hold children responsible for parents, or grandparents, or great-grandparents. So I've now gone back a few times to learn more about what my kids talk about my somewhat generic behavior. And I now have to add that in view of what I've said now, I've had a chance to live the American dream. When I said that when we were in Poland, I had to pinch myself to think that I was living there, that I might have lived there, I realized how lucky I am. And I want to share that with you. And I want to wish everybody the best. Thank you.